Ecco, yes, just a short introduction to a friend and a colleague as a historian, only for adding that I already had the pleasure to present this book in Venice in the Biennale, because it is also weird that the deep study, a close reading of Strada Novissima, the very first Biennale of architecture, based on ephemeral architecture, who opened up a season in architecture, and it was the 80s, so deep and so rich of temporary exhibitions and of many influences on also built architecture. That is the main focus I am interested in, by the way. But I think that all this work, I mean, it's a long work. He started as a PhD in London with Adrian Forti, who also is the author of the preface of the book. And of course there are many political also points of interest, because you know that this year, by chance, is the anniversary. The book was published last year, but this year is the anniversary of the first edition of Estate Romana by Renato Nicolini in Rome, when an architect was the deputy of culture for the Giulio Carlo Argan government of the city of Rome, and started, probably was the very beginning. But apart of that, what I would like to say is that I already said that ephemeral architecture is not a finished season, because we still can see how many Biennale of architecture and Biennale there are around the world. This is probably a phenomenon still ongoing. Makes me think that statement by Rem Koolhaas I think in The Generic City 20 years ago and more, that saying that the last style in architecture is the postmodern, and it will remain forever. And maybe it's true, this radical and paradoxical statement. But honestly, I think that to be more precise, it is true, we can see around, and I'm very interested to see what can be the relations through ephemeral and built examples. But honestly, I think that it has finished, that season finished, I would like to say, in the first 90s, in my opinion, thanks to a building, the Venturi and Scott Brown wing for the National Museum, the National Gallery in London, still with so many polemics around this disappearing project, with a sort of mannerist disappearing wing that you cannot even notice in Trafalgar Square. And also by a movie, a film of that period, filmed in Los Angeles, Heat, the famous film with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, making the detective, who was living in a Tom Main building. There is this famous scene where they're meeting at a restaurant for 10 minutes, and it's a Mantilini's restaurant. It's a famous restaurant by Tom Main. It's the first building realized by Tom Main in a very different way than the architecture did after. But I remember a statement by the detective Al Pacino inside the Tom Main building, saying that to me is the end of that city, because he was fighting with his wife because he was always at work, and he said, "I'm sick and tired of this postmodern shit." And to me, it's really the very end of that season symbolically. But I am very glad to can go more deep on these labels. We are so much overused. Probably because I studied in Venice, where the word postmodern was forbidden for historians, And also I think that is interesting because it's really a difficult issue, because it can drive you, it can make you get lost in what you are studying. And so also this is another important point for us, I think, because we are meeting this issue every day still. So thank you, Léa.
Okay. Hi. So I will speak in English as well, but I speak Italian, so if you have a question after in Italian, is that worth it? Please, you can, yeah. So first, just to continue on the thanks, I would like to also thank Manuel and Silvia for inviting me, and the studio Caputo for this fantastic invitation to speak here in Milan, and especially during the Arc Week, so it was a kind of coincidence, a good coincidence. And I would also like to thank my colleague Silvia Micheli, with whom I worked on part of the work I will present today, especially the part on Panseca. So, as Manuel mentioned, the work I will present today is extracted from one specific chapter of my book, Exhibiting the Postmodern, that is precisely on the history of the first international architecture exhibition of the Venice Biennale, and more generally on the coincidence between the explosion of is it okay? Yeah, okay. The explosion in the field of architecture of exhibition culture and the rise of postmodern architecture. And third, I would like to warn you, maybe this will come as a disappointment, but I will not talk about discotheque today. Manuel will be happy, because it's a subject that I think has been also extensively covered, amongst other, at the 2014 Monditalia exhibition by colleagues like Caterina Rossi, Giovanna Silva, and I will talk rather about exhibition and other forms of ephemeral architecture, and you will soon understand where the title of the lecture comes from. L'effimero è il segno di questa biennale, tra l'altro è un segno dei nostri tempi architettonici. Molti architetti, come noto, hanno scoperto nell'ultimo quindicennio il fascino dell'effimero e del futile. These words were written by architectural historian Cesare de Seta in I segni effimeri di questa biennale, his review of the 1980 Venice Architecture Biennale, for the communist newspaper Paese Sera. De Seta's disparaging commentary on the exhibition referred not only to architecture per se, but may also be applied to a general season within Italian history. This lecture will explain how, in the 1970s and 1980s, Italy, ephemeral architecture played a crucial role in redefining architecture and the city by exploiting the intricate relationship between aesthetic and politics. As I argue in my book, the 1980 Venice Architecture Biennale, the presence of the past, needs to be contextualized in a wider institutional history, both that of the Biennale itself and that of a series of other cultural institutions which, on both sides of the Atlantic, were shaping architecture in the post-1968 era. It also, so the 1980 Biennale, must be framed by Italy's socio-political context in the late 1970s, and that's what I will talk about in the first half of the lecture. Indeed, the exhibition of the 1980 Biennale, although announced as an international event promoting architecture after the modern movement, also arguably reflected and was determined by major transformations that took place in Italian society during a complex and contradictory period of its history. In other words, what appears as an endeavor embedded in a global discourse on architecture and the city was also, and not anecdotically, prompted by circumstance particular to the Italian society. From the late 1960s onward, Italy went through a great political unrest, followed by a wave of political terrorism, a time that British historian Paul Ginsberg summed up as a most extraordinary period of social ferment, the highest season of collective action in the history of the Republic. If, in and around 1968, social conflict intensified in many parts of the world, in Italy the protest movement against capitalism, consumerism, sexual repression, and the nuclear family lasted much longer and seemed much deeper than elsewhere in Europe. Even more significant, perhaps, was the fact that the protests in Italy were not marginal, and they were not only local movement, but they were spread throughout the country, through schools, universities, factories, and the society at large. And the image you see here is during the 1968 Venice Biennale, where there were also a lot of protests. Yet, by the late 1970s, a vast majority of the Italian population, disillusionized by these social protests and collective actions, were wary of constant political violence and terrorism, lost faith in collective forms of liberation or self-realization, and eventually yielded to an updated version of the consumerist way of life that had characterized the Italian economic miracle of the late 1950s and early 1960s. This social and political turnabout, known as il riflusso, which means backward surge, or also called ritorno al privato, the return to the private sphere, metaphorically recalling the flowing away of water in the period between high and low tide, has been summarized in slogans such as, "Enough with the demonstrations, let's go to the discotheque," or "At the discotheque to forget the rage." Connected with political and social disengagement was the impetus emergence of a private dimension in public life that had until then been held to the margins, and at the same time a growing eagerness for unbridled consumption, luxury, and fun. Also part of the riflusso was a political reorientation that was the rise in popularity of the Italian Socialist Party, which, under the direction of its new General Secretary, Bettino Craxi, went on to promote a cultural renewal aligned with the ideology of the riflusso. So while in 1968, as I showed, the Venice Biennale has served as a battlefield for protest, in the 1970s, so this is another chapter or another part of the book where I talk about this, in the 1970s, the Biennale was converted into a site of experimentation, linking the social with the cultural domain. And at the turn of the decade, so in 1980, it took a completely different twist, and the Biennale became, amongst other things, a locus for the promotion of hedonism, exuberance, individualism, and disengagement. So the 1980 first International Architecture Exhibition, The Presence of the Past, and the Strada Novissima that you see here, and moreover its mediatization, hailed a renewal of architecture language that also mirrored a general mutation towards a more colorful and joyful Italy. In the exhibition catalogue, Paolo Portoghesi, the main curator, called for la fine del proibizionismo, the end of prohibition, and the historical, referring to the, of course, to the ban on alcoholic beverage in the United States from 1920s to 1930s. So this fine del proibismo went beyond the mere visual and architectural aspects. In fact, if modern architecture was for Portoghesi the symbol of an abstract power to be fought and overturned, the end of prohibitionism also suggested a wind of change, using architecture and culture in general as a powerful instrument of social transformation. The years of lead, the riflusso, and the political rise of the Socialist Party. On the 9th of May 1978, a special edition of l'Unità, the newspaper of the Italian Communist Party, bore its front page the headline, Aldo Moro assassinated, the heinous crime of the BR offends and challenges the social conscience of all Italians. That morning, the corpse of Aldo Moro, leader of the Italian Christian Democrat Party, former prime minister and one of the most important figures of post-war Italian politics, kidnapped 2 months earlier in Rome by the commando of the extreme left terrorist group known as Red Brigades, had been found in the trunk of a red Renault 4 parked in Via Caetani, just midway between the headquarters of the Christian Democrats and the Communist Party. A chapter is closed, another one opens, wrote l'Unità, perceptively summing up what immediately appears as a major turning point in the history of contemporary Italy. During the 1970s, Italy was severely affected by the first energy crisis and suffered the highest inflation of the Western world. Concurrently, and up until the early 1980s, the country was weighed down by political violence coming from the extreme right and the extreme left, as well as the Italian secret services. This long period of socio-political turmoil, which translated into violence and terrorism, later came to be referred as the anni di piombo, years of lead. If highly complex and still subject to historical reinterpretation, the anni di piombo, lasting until the early 1980s, were marked by a series of tragic events that accounted for hundreds of dead and wounded. The grim and violent period of in the history of modern Italy began on the 12th of December 1969, when at 4:37 p.m. a bomb exploded at the Piazza Fontana branch of Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura in Milan, killing 17 people and wounding 88. That's the image you see here. The same day, 3 other bombs were detonated in Milan and Rome. Following the bombing of Piazza Fontana, the so-called strategy of tension, involving a relentless series of bomb attacks and other violent actions, would determine a general climate of uncertainty and fear amongst the Italian population, especially in major city centers. This was aggravated by measures taken by the United States to hinder the growing popularity and electoral success of the Communist Party and other leftist groups. The terrorism escalated in and around 1977, reaching its apex in 1980, the year of the Biennale. On 27 of June 1980, just a month, or exactly a month to the day before the inauguration of the Venice Architecture Biennale, Itavia Flight 870, an Italian commercial flight traveling from Bologna to Palermo, was shot down in all likelihood by a missile fired from military aircraft above the Tyrrhenian Sea, somewhere between Ponza and Ustica, killing all the 81 passengers. Only a few weeks later, and that's the image here, immediately after the inauguration of the Biennale on 2nd of August 1980, a bomb attack at the Bologna station killed 88 people and wounded approximately 200. So it is important to bear in mind the exceptional magnitude of tension and violence, the escalation of bomb attacks and political murders, and the social tension and endless demonstrations provoked by this climate during the period 1969 to 1980, roughly. Indeed, referring to what he calls the hell of the anni di piombo, Italian historian Guido Cranes has noted that few Western societies have been, in peacetime, shook by such an overwhelming wave of violence, terror, and dehumanization as that which occurred in Italy during the years of Lead. Il riflusso and its ensuing explosion of self-absorption and consumerism, its emphasis on private life over public and political commitment, and its taste for whimsical and eclectic citation of forms and styles of the past, free from the concern of philological accuracy, was a strong reaction to the disruptive events of the preceding period. Yet, if mainly seen as the consequence of the 1970s Italian sociopolitical climate, the riflusso also had its distant origin in the modernization of the economic boom of the 1950s and 60s. In this period, the Italian middle class, attracted by the promise of an easy consumerism and the possibility of individual advancement, had become the firm supporters of a moderate democratic status quo. By 1980, this tendency had become generalized to society as a whole, and the strong American influence that had emerged after the war had been fiercely contested by students and workers from 1968 onwards, had now entered a golden age. The riflusso can be described as an attitude intensely based on success and as an absolute value, and consumption as a symbol of advancement for individuals. On the neglected, if not contempt, of any kinds of rules or collective constraint, and on the aspiration to personal affirmation that pays little attention to ethical concerns. But this phenomenon was not limited to Italy, because in that period also, the period of the riflusso also corresponds to the beginning of the neoliberal reign of Margaret Thatcher in England and the triumph of Ronald Reagan in the US. Yet what was particular to Italy's case was the intensity and the rapidity of the transition between one period and the other. In 1977, an increased level of politically motivated violence in mass demonstrations and new escapist attitude was summarized in the January 1979 Panorama magazine headline, "The new philosophy of the Italian is, we might as well have fun." The spark of the riflusso in the Italian mass media is believed to have been a series of letters published in the front page of the Milan-based newspaper Corriere della Sera, in which fictitious anonymous readers publicly exposed their private lives, such as a 50-year-old professional married with 2 children who was having suicidal thoughts after falling in love with another woman. So this the letter was published in the front page of Corriere della Sera, but it was actually a fake letter. It was discovered years later. This letter was, it's very hot here. This letter was accompanied by a lengthy comment from the newspaper's editor that triggered a wave of responses from real readers. So what that means is that it was expressing the desire of a society in which politics would not be the only focus. These letters, published in the newspaper, occupied spaces that just a few years before had been given to students and workers' demonstrations, to list of deaths caused by terrorism, or to grim news of austerity caused by economic crisis. After Moro's murder, people wanted to go back to normality and finally have some fun. So beyond the violent political conflict of the mid-70s, the mid-70s had also brought some significant changes in behavior and mentality of the Italians. In 1974, the Christian Democrat had lost a referendum aiming to abolish the 1970 law legislating divorce. In 1978, the Italian government legalized abortion and closed psychiatric hospital. Around the same time, Italians fell into the grips of the Saturday night fever of the disco, fueled by the success of the eponymous 1977 John Travolta film poster that you see here. In the late 70s, also, at the same time, the Socialist Party underwent a radical transformation, slowly but steadily augmenting its influence on Italy's political scene. And in 1983, finally, its leader, Bettino Craxi, was appointed prime minister. The Communist and the Socialist parties drew further apart for the first time, and the Socialists set about acting as a free agent. The direction taken by the Socialist Party was motivated by both the space and the need within the Italian political spectrum for a force that was anti-Stalinist, social democratic, and explicitly reformist. The Socialists of Bettino Craxi decided to go its own way, slowly shaping its own version of the center-left. understanding that the values associated with capitalism and neoliberalism, while distancing itself from Marxism, would help the party to increase electoral consensus. In the post-war decade, the socialists, like the communists, and I just warn you, the part on politics is almost finished. In the post-war decades, the socialists, like the communists, had a disdain for consumerism and commercial entertainment. But after 1976, Craxi fruitfully exploited this widespread desire for change of the Italians. He understood that the visual aspect of communication represented a powerful instrument of persuasion. Characteristic of this approach was Craxi's rather informal clothing in his public appearance. No less significant was the change in the logo of the Socialist Party, marking a break within the party's Marxist past. So as you can see here, the transformation of the logo, the hammer and sickle that had graced the party's symbol were slowly first reduced in size and by 1985 altogether disposed of and replaced by the red carnation. During the 1970s, the Biennale, the Venice Biennale, served also as not only a transatlantic laboratory exploring questions related to the civic and public participation, but also as a political laboratory. In the late 70s and 1980s, the Socialist Party exerted a strong influence on the Biennale, notably during the 6-year presidency of Carlo Ripadimeana. Some of Ripadimeana's curatorial choices while leading the Biennale made manifest the growing apart of the Socialist Party from the Communist. Following the 37th art exhibition, the 1976 Biennale, on the 25th of January 1977, Ripadimeana declared to the Corriere della Sera his intention to present the board with a proposal of conferences and exhibitions on cultural dissent in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, to mark the 60th anniversary of the October Revolution. The Communist Party, aligned with Moscow, disapproved of Ripadimeana's idea, of course, and the issue became a matter of state as well as a diplomatic problem. The Biennale section directors, Vittorio Gregotti, Luca Ronconi, and Giacomo Gambetti, presented their resignation. Yet, on 15 of November, after fierce polemics from the Soviet in reaction to the international presentation and the boycott of many Italian organizations and intellectuals, the Biennale del Dissenso, that was called Biennale of Dissent, opened in the Hall of Mirrors of the Napoleonic wing of the Museo Correr in Piazza San Marco, with an underground video recorded message from Russian scientist and dissident Andrei Sakharov, who had been denied a visa to come to Italy. Thus, the 1980 Venice Architecture Biennale, you see here the official poster, not surprisingly served as a cultural stage in which the Socialist Party could reveal its specificity and assert its difference from the Communist Party. But also, the exhibition resonated with notions of playfulness and evoked fairgrounds and other spaces of consumption and entertainment. Nonetheless, in form and content, it first appeared devoid of social implication, it was in fact a perfect ideological and political instrument for the Socialist Party. Since the communists had historically been linked to socially engaged architecture and to the modern movement in general, a new plurality of architectural languages that was neither modernist nor conservative seemed perfectly suited to the image the socialists wanted to project. Now, the second part of this talk is called an ephemeral season. In the 1980 Venice Architecture Biennale, if the 1980 Venice Architecture Biennale ephemeral Strada Novissima can undoubtedly be associated with many features of the riflusso, hedonism, individualism, consumerism, joyfulness, the need of color, and the dissolution of utopian ideals, it was not an isolated example, but rather the most visible sign of a general ephemeral season that conquered not only the gallery spaces and the museums, but was also fully embedded on the political stage and in the city as a whole. Now I will talk about what Manuel mentioned in introduction, the Estate Romana. While the Socialist Party under Craxi's leadership was beginning a radical transformation of its politics using, amongst other things, cultural institutions to promote the renewal of Italian society, in Rome, the communist-led city government that emerged from the local election of 1976 promoted a completely new type of cultural event called Estate Romana, Roman summer, translate, during which the entire city became the arena for a series of public cultural manifestations for the citizens, employing an abundance of creativity as a mean to overcome the tense political climate of the period. In 1976, the historian Giulio Carlo Argan, the art historian Giulio Carlo Argan, became the first non-Christian Democrat mayor of Rome since the Second World War. An influential and respected art historian, professor at the Sapienza, former president of the International Association of Art Critics, etc., Argan was elected as an independent supported by the Communist Party. During his years in the city's administration between 76 and 79, Argan engaged in a fierce battle against real estate speculation and an important dialogue with the Vatican. Furthermore, he set out to use culture as a mean to overcome the tense climate of violence that I talked about and political struggle that had compromised public life in cities, as well as the division between the urban center and the periphery. In August 1977, a year after Argan's election, the Councillor for Culture of the Rome city government, the young architect communist Renato Nicolini, conceived and launched the Estate Romana, a series of spectacular inventions that managed to contaminate modernity and postmodernity, bourgeoisie and popular classes, erudition and divulgation, in a fascinating mixture of representative and new urban culture. These innovative cultural manifestations, and you see a few images here, represented a fusion of languages but also of spaces that had, up to then, remained disconnected and were suddenly reunited and reused with significant decontextualized effect in the overall perception of the city. So the events of the Estate Romana included major cinema screening, theater and opera, and a variety of dance and musical performances that used historic and rarely used urban spaces, such as, or rarely used at the time. I mean, now they are a major touristic attraction, but they were not really used at the time, such as Basilica of Maxentius, the Trajan's Market, or the Circus Maximus. And they become, these events, they became the symbol of the culture of the ephemeral culture. So it was both an incentive for the citizen to return to public spaces that they have been maybe afraid of going to because of all the terrorist attack and violence. And also it was an innovative way of imagining free time and leisure and organizing the movement both within the metropolis and between the center and the periphery. We'll see an example later. It was also an occasion of negotiating the relation between the new and the ancient, all while promoting the blurring of boundaries between popular culture and the culture of the elite. The younger generation, in particular, were opening up to a less moralistic lifestyle. They were attracted to collective entertainment in favor of public art and saw the potential of rediscovering the newly available richness of Italian historic centers. So here is an example of cinema screening within the Basilica di Maxentius, for example. The Estate Romana's first event took place in July 1977. So as Manuel said, it's the anniversary, and this year in Rome they are having, I think, a series of events to commemorate the 40th anniversary. It was an immediate and unexpected success, so much so that in the early 80s, the idea of the estate was emulated in many European cities. For example, Jacques Lang, the French Minister of Culture, was particularly enthusiastic by this Roman experiment. Then, after 77, in the summer of 79, a unique and special edition of the Estate Romana was organized with the title Parco Centrale, that referred to Walter Benjamin's 1938 essay on Charles Baudelaire's Paris, then also one of the few Benjamin texts translated in Italian, in which the author described the French capital as the cradle of modernity and ephemeral space in which the individual experience is dispersed in the crowd of the boulevard. Parco Centrale, the event of 79, had been imagined by Nicolini in collaboration with Italian architects Franco Purini and Laura Termes, as a sort of theoretical manifesto that was meant to give a more open and complex character and set the tone for future development of the festival. So you see here the map with the 4 different locations of the Estate Romana or the Parco Centrale. What happened is that they tried to decentralize the idea of the Estate Romana, so not having only event in the city center, but having also spread the cultural manifestation over 4 sites outside the Aurelian Wall. So first there was Villa Torlonia for television, so each of the 4 sites was linked to a form of art or performance. So Villa Torlonia for television, and that's a drawing by Purini. The Istituto Case Popolari of the housing estate situated between Viale Angelico and Via Sabottino for theater, and that's the Teatro Scientifico that is now rebuilt in, I think, at the Maxi. I just got the invitation for the inauguration end of June this year. The Matatoio in Testaccio, which was a former slaughterhouse, was reused. Slaughterhouse that was closed for 18 years was reused for the site on music. And the Valle della Caffarella in Appia Antica Park was used for dance. So although the Estate Romana did not invent new form of art, as explained by Purini, it had much of its cultural foundation in the Roman neo-avant-garde of the 60s and 70s, its novelty was to expose and bring the culture of the underground to a much wider audience, so to general public. The Estate Romana was an incredibly successful project with major impact on the artistic and political life of Rome and beyond. And according to Franco Purini, the great merit belongs to Nicolini for bringing masses of citizens to the streets, into the street and into the squares, for rediscovering the irreplaceable value of public space as a site of discussion, exchange, and community value, and for the conquest of a new freedom of expression and communication. Another example of the long-lasting impact of the riflusso on the cultural life of Italian city was the reactivation at the end of the 70s of the Venice Carnival, a tradition that had been abandoned for centuries. Indeed, the Venice Carnival, as we know it today, is a modern invention developed by the Venice city government and the Biennale together as yet another way of bringing joy and color into people's life. Venice was just coming out of a harsh period of economic crisis and was in search of ways to reestablish the contact with its population and to forge a new relationship with its mass of tourists that, of course, became greater, much and more. The impetus for reactivating the old and famous tradition of the Carnival also gave expression to the desire to surmount death and to court glamour in the face of denial. So also at exactly the same time, in 1979, following the creation of the architecture section of the Biennale, Paolo Portoghesi, along with the head of the theater section, Maurizio Scaparo, organized the exhibition Venezia e lo spazio scenico, or Venice and the Scenic Space, an exhibition that was meant to accompany the theater festival of the Biennale, while also launching this new idea of the reactivation of the Carnival. For this event, and I'm sure you know this example, the architecture and theater sector of the Biennale came together on the reevaluation of places as a mattress of culture and to reinvent and design the existing city through the reinstatement of the imaginary and the new use of the ephemeral. So in occasion of this exhibition, the Biennale commissioned one of the most notable work of ephemeral architecture ever built, the Teatro del Mondo by Aldo Rossi. Existing for less than a year, the Teatro del Mondo arrived on the lagoon of Venice on a raft in the foggy morning of the 11th of November, 1979. And it was a steel structure cladded with timber panel and with a central plan that was reminiscent of Palladio's Villa Capra. And it was temporarily docked at the Punta della Dogana, the image you see here, providing, as Rossi would poetically comment, a topographic alteration and a provisional yet conclusive appendix to this very central point of St. Mark's Basin. It was an intriguing temporary floating structure meant to host a series of artistic performances in different parts of Venice. And here just a few more images of the construction. In the 1970s and 80s, the taste for the ephemeral went beyond exhibitions and temporary celebratory building. Moved by self-celebratory intention and interested in mass culture and the potential use of mass media in politics, Craxi involved the Sicilian artist-architect Filippo Panseca with the idea of revisiting the communicative strategy of his party. So it was also Panseca who redesigned the logo of the party. Panseca combined his architectural sensibility and his artistic experimentation with a perfect understanding of the necessity to restyle the party's image, offering a popular type of representation and changing its impact on the public domain. Panseca's artistic contribution to the mutation of the party's image should also be remembered for the succession of themed backdrops that he designed for the party's annual congress from the late 70s through the early 1990s. The staging of the 43rd Congress in Verona in 1984 was dominated by the discotheque, so I will talk about discotheque, due to its octagonal-shaped bleachers covered with mirrors that formed the podium for the speaker. It occurred in a moment when, in Italy, discotheques became an established form of entertainment and transgression. From this gleaming pulpit, Bettino Craxi was completely visible to and consumed by its mass audience. In the background, a neon light in the form of a carnation was presented with the slogan, "A Right Society." The overall spatial setting was more that of a television studio rather than a conventional party congress. And the general atmosphere was closer to that of an American political assembly convention rather than a traditional Italian political assembly. And for the first time in Italy's history, the politic of the spectacle was taking shape with triumphant tones. Other congress followed, and Panseca consistently worked on temporary scenography solution intended to steer a mass audience. For the 44th Congress of the party, the Fair of Rimini, Panseca built a wide kitsch stage in the shape of a Greek temple, with the frieze turned into a LED screen projecting a flow of messages. It was an imposing facade in papier-mâché and styrofoam that was meant to be biodegradable according to the ecological lines of its artistic creator. Well, Manuel wants to take a picture. Yes. Go ahead. Little break. Ok? Possiamo continuare? Okay. In 1991, 20 meters of Berlin Wall in styrofoam blocks were arranged at the PSI Congress in Rimini. The same year, Panseca conceived the triumphal arch at the Bari Congress. His and Craxi's obsession with ancient architecture displayed a willful intention to celebrate the party and its leader, with little interest in durable installations and more enthusiasm for the accumulation of images to be rapidly broadcasted through television and press. As a result, Pansecca's ephemeral installations were totally in tune with the Italian political agenda of the 1980s. In his role, Pansecca was accused of being a courtier to the party. He was even called the architect of Craxi, a claim that he has always rejected, defending his artistic independency and stating that his collaboration with the PSI represented a great opportunity for artistic experimentation. However, the arrangement with by far the greatest impact was Pansecca's design for the 45th Congress held in the former Ansaldo factory in Milan in 1989 and become a sort of emblem of the success and excess of Italian post-war politics. This time, Pansecca designed a spectacular stage dominated by an 8 meters high lead pyramid. Its absolute form and colossal dimension conveyed the idea of a stronger and stronger hierarchical structure of the party, and at the same time, a change of strategy in its political communication. The image of Craxi's face was offered as if he were a pop star, or a pharaoh, as it was observed at the time. It was a way to connect the leader to the party's militants, those compressed in the long naves of the factory plant, generating a mass phenomenon of consumption of the idol, previously unheard in the history of Italy's First Republic. Through a phenomenon of spectacularization of the politics, Craxi himself became a political showman, being the very first Italian politician to truly understand the power of media, and in particular of TV, as an innovative tool and form of soft propaganda. That's the same 45th Congress, but seen from... The choice of ephemeral architecture as a key strategy for staging the Socialist Party's event might have been a reaction to the use and abuse of architecture in the propaganda of totalitarian regime. Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini all instrumentalized architecture and used monumental construction as a means for spreading their political ideologies while consolidating their totalitarian view of the world. In this respect, temporary installations, rather than monumental constructions, may have sprung from Craxi's intention of conferring an idea of possibilities, flexibility, and progress. In a sense, the immutability and permanence of traditional monument, considered an obsolete model of the relationship between politics and architecture, was rejected in favor of new forms associated that were at once sensational and ephemeral. So, to conclude, it was through ephemeral rather than durable, as we saw, that architects and politicians redefined architecture and the city after the modern movement, and more so after Italy's harsh period of sociopolitical turmoil and unrest of the years of lead. Yet, times have changed, and we can wonder what was the lasting legacy of these years of the riflusso. How did the 1980s ephemeral season change the form of conceiving and perceiving architecture and the ways through which we navigate and experience the city today? The Estate Romana, the Teatro del Mondo, the 1980 Venice Biennale, Strada Novissima, and to a certain extent the political scenographies of Filippo Pansecca marked a turning point in the history of architecture, generating a particularly successful connection between architecture's aesthetic and politics. Many features of postmodernism converge in these ephemeral architectures, spanning from consumerism, pluralism, communication, the supremacy of images, and the architecture's star system or cult of personality. Despite a certain pastiche aspect, these architectures dissolved the division between real and unreal, and thus contributed to the postmodern understanding of representation. The way in which these constructions used and recuperated disused spaces in historical city centers was also utterly postmodern by creating a renewed sense of place. But what happened when these ephemeral displays and architecture vanished forever only to survive in people's minds and in the annals of architectural history. Italy's ephemeral season brought architecture into a wider cultural world, as the architecture exhibition, the temporary installations, pop-ups, concept stores, and other ephemeral manifestation of architecture became another form of cultural production. Therefore, the success of these 1970s and 1980s ephemeral architectures was partly due to an unprecedented understanding of the power of scenography and spectacularization, the sense of place and historical consciousness. Yet beyond their historical or linguistic turn, the visionary aspect of these ephemeral architectures was that, years before the internet and the digital revolution, Nicolini, Purini, Rossi, Portoghesi, Panseca, and others had grasped that in both architecture and society, images would become more powerful than objects. Thank you.
Thank you, Léa. I warmly invite you for profiting to make questions. I would start with mine first, just to waiting for yours. Because I was thinking, I never found that legendary interview to Portoghesi in the 80s asking him, that there was a journalist asking him, what is the postmodern? Explain us clearly. And he dared to answer the postmodern is Craxi, but I never found the original, so it seems also a legend. No, it's a tale, it's something to look for, but only. But that's a legend anyway. I was thinking also that in this, this story. In the 1980 is also the year, because we have to evoke another character, where it was founded not only the first Architecture Biennale, but also Canale 5, cioè the Berlusconi enterprise on television. Started before in Milan, Tele Milano, but officially starts in 1980, of course, with Bettino Craxi support, and the Socialist Party was always been a supporter. So it's really another change, a year of change for many reasons, and also in architecture is considered the end of collective movements. From that day on, and also it's the moment where they stop to do manifestos, because it's in a way the end of utopia. But in Italy, utopia finished. Was the socialist utopia dies in the Renault 4, the red Renault 4, where Aldo Moro was killed. That the point. I mean.
Yeah, I didn't want to talk too much about.
No, in fact.
But of course, that's the symbol of the end of collective. The Strada Novissima, although it's a collection of 20 architects, it's not about collective at all. It's about individual languages, each architect having a completely different understanding of what postmodernism is and a completely different language. And it's really the start of well, maybe not the start, because one could say that it started with Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, but it's definitely an important turn in the star system of architecture. So I think it's true that it represents also the shift from collective to individual, but that's also the case with the shift between Anni di Piombo and Riflusso. It's really the shift between this idea of collective and versus the individualism.
Yes, I guess you can see also many, I don't know, I was thinking to shops, to contemporary events, even if it seems so distant, this word is aesthetics, but actually, okay, anyway.
One thing that you said in the introduction, and I didn't talk so much about it, but it's true that this idea that nowadays we have more and more biennale and triennale of architecture, is also, in a sense, the heredity of this ephemeral season or ephemeral, this idea that architecture is also and maybe as much about ephemeral. Like I'm thinking as I speak, but I also think that maybe for architects today it's almost more important to be in the Biennale or the Chicago Biennale or whatever than to build, almost. Like it's as important. So it became another form of architecture, another form of that is obviously amplified by the media and becomes very important.
Do you recall any other architecture biennale as influential as Strada Nuovissima from a language point of view?
If I think that other were as the other of the Venice, yeah. Well, in the book I finished, but I have to say that this is maybe not so much of an impartial judgment, but I finished the conclusion of the book is about the Colas Biennale, and I think if there is one, it's this one. I mean, it's hard to say because the history will tell us, if it will be talked about in 20 years. But I think in terms of having, I mean, people could be for or against, but in terms of having sort of a strong argument or bringing something, maybe not as strong as the 1980, but I would say that it's the one that is closest. And it also triggered a lot of polemics. Like people were quite strongly, before I talked with Manuel, he said there was no professor of university that agreed with that Biennale. It was quite a divided opinion. But I think it's hard to do something that strong. And part of the success, this is also in other parts of the book, but parts of the success of the 1980 was also the use of the Arsenale. That is now used every year, but I mean, it was the first time, so it was a big discovery. Maybe for the younger people, it's the Arsenale was never a public space because it's obviously a very important building in the history of Venice. They built the ship there, and there were thousands of people working there, but it was never kind of seen by the people that didn't work in the factories. So I think the contrast between the ephemeral architecture and this incredible, stable or building was part of the success, and this you cannot repeat because it was the first time, and yeah.
In fact, I'm against the mythology of the Strada Nuovissima, but it's true because it's something that then came to an end, that kind of architecture quite quickly. But yes, the point, the astonishing, there is no possibility to go through because I think temporary events allows you to rediscover and to reopen the large amount of historical fabrics that we have around, and you have seen that every administration in almost every city tries to do that from that time on. And of course Portoghese saw that in Rome, thanks to Nicolini, in the open space, but not only with monuments, also the ex Mattatoio, which was a not important building, but very big and abandoned and closed. The Ansaldo, if you think, was the same thing that Boeri tried to do. I mean, among many others, in every city they are trying to open up abandoned space. And of course, the Arsenale was astonishing because it's a unique building. It's not like a church. It's a building. It's there only there in Venice because you know the Arsenale. So you cannot compete with that. It's quoted in the Divine Comedy by Dante. It was a surprise. Nobody remembered to have Arsenale there. Nobody. Also because it's in a hidden part of the city. It's on the lagoon. It's unique. And now it's a problem for the Biennale because every year is bigger. You have more spaces, more gardens, more buildings. You get lost and you easily lost the sense of a Biennale when you arrive at the end. This last one of art.
Imagine that
the Gaggiandre.
only the very first, like which thing that is now. And the other thing is that now, of course, the Biennale is, and that is more from the late 70s, like from the Gregotti Biennale, that they started to use other spaces like churches and other industrial spaces or post-industrial in the city, and that is another aspect of the Biennale. When you go today, you have not only the Arsenal in the Giardini, but you have all these. So the exhibition is really kind of intermingling with the urban fabric, and